Ladies, gentlemen, this is the European History Lecture for Friday, the 3rd of June, 2022. This is, in fact, the last Friday of the school year. Somebody just pointed out. And first of all, I am going to start with a salute to you two for finding hate speech in my lesson about the final solution and striking my video with a warning, the first one I've ever gotten. And I have written an appeal, and we'll say if they take it seriously. But apparently the teaching of history, because we deal with difficult subjects, either trips off an automatic censor or some woke snowflake little jerk who thinks that talking about the final solution equates to advocacy for the final solution.
What?
Morons.
Yeah.
I love the modern world. Oh, wait, no, that's not the right word. I can't say the right word in class. So you two, do the right thing. Jerks.
Wow.
Okay. Having said that, we are going to explore the issue of genocide and totalitarianism a little more.
What happened?
You have to say anything.
You too.
Yeah, because they said it was hate speech. So I expect them to overturn their ruling, but we'll see, because you never know when dealing with commies and those who think that policing speech is the way to go. Okay, let me get this soundy thing off first.
This is amazing sound for full-time jobs.
It's very dramatic. Okay.
Gotta tell you, if it explodes, you guys are the first.
After World War II, the Nazis... Everything okay?
Yeah, I have to plug it in because it's dying.
Okay.
And if it dies,
After World War II, some Nazis were tried for war crimes, most famously at the Nuremberg trials. But many perpetrators, especially within the SS, were freed from Allied custody or escaped, and were assisted by a set of rat lines, which are basically like an underground railroad for Nazis, to escape from Europe and go around the world, particularly to Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina most notably. And these rat lines included sympathizers or people who owed the Nazis a favor, and they worked hand in glove with an organization known as Odessa. The Odessa organization helped SS men escape and set up new lives and continue to operate behind the scenes. And some of these entered the Arab world and ended up working against the Jews in Israel. Bless you. One of the most famous of the SS escapees, if you will, was Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was a colonel, but his power went far beyond what a colonel would normally have. Eichmann had become a fluent speaker of Yiddish. And Yiddish is sort of the pidgin language that Jews spoke in Eastern Europe. It's not Hebrew, it's not Russian, it's not Polish, it's not Ukrainian, it's Yiddish. And it's sort of a blending of language, sort of the way Americans and Europeans on the one hand and Chinese on the other communicated with one another 150 years ago, where there was a sort of mixture of Chinese words and English words with no regard for grammar. Eichmann established a new identity in Argentina with his family, who were shuttled there as well, as a man named Ricardo Clement. In 1960, the Simon Wiesenthal organization, Wiesenthal is the Wiesenthal is the central picture, the man with the mustache and bald directly underneath the Escher print. And Wiesenthal was a survivor of the Holocaust who helped Americans when Americans were interested in pursuing Nazi war criminals. But as the Cold War develops, the Americans become much more interested in defeating the Soviets than in pursuing the Nazis. And to defeat the Soviets, we needed the West Germans on our side. So there was an easing off on pursuit of many, at least, Nazi war criminals. So Wiesenthal goes to Vienna, Austria, and establishes an organization run by himself, which gathered information on SS men and war criminals and criminals against humanity who took part in the Holocaust and other things, whether they were German or Ukrainian or White Russian or whatever. His files threatened the architectural stability of the building that his apartments were rented in. That's how heavy they were, because in those days files were not electronic data. Then again, you couldn't have some YouTube organization censor your files. You just had them in paper form. And Wiesenthal's organization had tracked Eichmann to a suburb of Buenos Aires, where he was living with his family and building a house, working on a house. This information was leaked to Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. And Mossad decided to do something about it. Eichmann, being the expert on Jews because he spoke Yiddish, was instrumental in many of the details of the Holocaust. While Reinhard Heydrich ran the Wannsee Conference, it was Eichmann who handled a lot of the detail work of implementation. So Eichmann took a bus home, and he had to walk across about a city block and a half of open space that was fairly dark in order to get home. So one night there was a car broken down in that space, and some people were working on it. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing unusual. Eichmann actually is a bus later than usual, which drives everyone in the operation nuts. What if this doesn't work? What if he's been tipped off? What if he and his family have gone? And then Eichmann gets off the next bus and starts walking down the dark area. And just after he passes the car and the people around it, who are Mossad agents, grab him, stuff him in the car, and take him to a safe house. In the safe house, they then are getting him ready to ship to Israel. But the problem is, they've got to get him out of Argentina, and there's a legal snafu that people in their own government are insisting on, that Eichmann agrees to be extradited to Israel, which is something he would never agree to. The Israelis get a signature. And Eichmann is smuggled out of Argentina, and for the first time in history, and really one of the only times in history, the Jewish state of Israel is going to get to put on trial one of the men who were instrumental in the final solution to the Jewish question. The RGs are furious. Their government is sympathetic to the Nazis on and off because their government is run by a South American fascist named Juan Perón. His wife Evita becomes famous later because of a series of plays and movies called Evita, about this blonde bombshell who's the wife of the president of Argentina. Well, the president of Argentina is the one who invited all the Nazis. So they put Eichmann on trial. It's a stone chamber. Eichmann is in a bulletproof phone booth, because the fear is that one of the relatives of the victims, millions and millions of victims, is going to somehow smuggle in a submachine gun or a bomb or something, and they'll kill Eichmann rather than have justice done. And the Israeli government is committed to him being put on trial, and for the trial to be a real trial, not a show trial, where Eichmann gets to defend himself. He has a lawyer, all of the rights that a person in the Western world would expect if they were accused of crimes. So this is the background. In New York City, there is a woman named Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is probably that generation's authority on totalitarianism. After World War II, she wrote a book called The Origins of Totalitarianism, where in a philosophical fashion she studies the creation of totalitarian states and how they operate. She was a disciple and a lover of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is the German Jose Ortega y Gasset. He's a German philosopher of the early to mid 20th century, and comes up with some very interesting ideas. Well, Heidegger has Hannah Arendt as his student. She's a Jew, but a fully assimilated Germanized Jew. And like many professors and students in those days, they had an affair. So she's famous, both for being a disciple of Heidegger and for the work she does on totalitarianism. She, at this time, around 1960, is teaching at the New School in New York, which is sort of their version of the Charter Academy, but much more high-powered fancy. And she is invited by, I think, New Yorker magazine to attend the trial and write about it. This is a Jewish intellectual who's an expert on totalitarianism, who speaks perfect, at least very good English, who's a teacher, who understands the Holocaust in a variety of ways. She left Germany before the Holocaust. Around the time Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, she split and left, and good for her. Kept her alive. And what everyone expected was that she would report on the trial. And in her reportage, she would describe this demon in human form that is the man who implemented much of the final solution. She would reveal what made him different from other people. She would show in her writing a moral outrage. That's what they expected. Well, the trial went on, and Eichmann claimed, the universal claim that people who were accused of war crimes in those days claimed, we were following orders. They were lawful orders. My government and my Führer were the lawful leaders of my country. I was an officer in the SS. I was bound by my oath to Hitler personally to obey his orders. My responsibility is not for what I did, because I was a tool. I was an implement in Hitler's hand and in the hands of people like Heydrich. I bear no responsibility for following another person's orders. This is a very Prussian answer, because in the Prussian army, every single officer can command anyone lower than them to do anything. And the soldier is expected to obey, period. Now, since this time, as a result of the Nuremberg trials and the trial of Eichmann and other things, as part of American military training and doctrine, officers and soldiers are taught enough about military law so that theoretically they'll have an understanding between a lawful and an unlawful order. So, if an officer in the heat of battle orders an enemy village to be destroyed, if the people don't reveal the terrorists, and this actually happened in Vietnam at a place called My Lai, an American lieutenant named Calley was with a unit that had just been seriously mauled by the Viet Cong, and they were angry. And they went into the nearest village, knowing that this village had given aid and support to this very Viet Cong terrorists who had shot at and murdered and were killed and wounded so many of them. And if this is something that as a parent, at least I think you would learn not to do. You don't spank your kids when you're angry. You spank your kids when you are calm, so that you are using the spanking as a communication tool, not as a way to vent your frustration. Well, our troops were angry, and they started interrogating the villagers, and the villagers were uncooperative. And there was also a language problem. There were cultural problems, and it was clear that these guys were out of control. And they basically wipe out the village. They burn the houses to the ground. They kill civilians, and it is a fairly serious event that turns a lot of Americans against the Vietnam War. So what we expect now in the training that we give our officers at West Point and at Annapolis and at the Air Force Academy somewhere in Texas, and what we expect soldiers to learn when they go through basic training, is what is an unlawful order. And an order to do what happened at My Lai would be an unlawful order. This is an order in violation of the Constitution. It's in violation of the Military Code of Justice. It's in violation of the American approach to war. Which is a hell of a thing to do to a 19-year-old who's just been trained to fight and obey his superiors and to follow the chain of command. And you're expecting a 19-year-old who's just gone through this, who's in battle, who's got all the adrenaline that battle is going to bring, who has learned to trust his sergeant and trust his lieutenant, trust their superiors, and they give him an order, and he's expected in the heat of battle to say, it's an unlawful order. I'm sorry, I respectfully cannot follow your order. You understand that one of the few times when a summary death penalty can be executed, what a word, is if you are a leader in battle and your soldier doesn't follow your orders. You're supposed to shoot that soldier, and that's true in any army. In the American army, in the Russian army, in the Chinese army, in the Arabian armies. If I'm above you and I say, attack that hill, and you say no, I'm going to point at one of you randomly, attack that hill. And if you don't, I'll take my sidearm and I will make it very clear that if you don't immediately start following my orders, that'll be the last thing you do. Now, one of the reasons why military leadership works so hard to build camaraderie and a sense of discipline is so that this never happens. So that there is a bond of trust that doesn't require you to brandish a weapon at your own subordinates. But what we're talking about here are the most extreme of cases. Heat of battle, emotions running high, adrenaline pumping through your blood. Is it a lawful order? Is it an unlawful order? It's just a hell of a thing to expect a fresh soldier to make a determination about, especially when the lieutenant or the sergeant may take a sidearm out and say, you will follow my order. This is not a debating society. Do it. You see how rife this is. But this all comes from our cultural refusal to accept the answer, I was just following orders. So Eichmann is then forced to defend specific charges in detail. And his appearance is not satanic. He doesn't rant and rave like Hitler. He seems like a clerk, like a guy who works as an accountant. He has glasses. He does not present a formidable physical presence. The trial does result in his conviction, and within a year he was executed. But to the extent possible, Israel did try to make it a fair trial. But there were issues relating to this trial and to the Nuremberg trials about putting specific individuals on trial for actions that were bigger than just their own choices. This is a man who really, in the minds of the Jewish people and most of the people around the world, was being put on trial for the Holocaust, for the final solution. And there's an enormity to that. And there's a question philosophically, ethically, morally, and legally about that that is a little troubling. Can you just pick somebody out from the other side and make them the poster child for what you hate? and then put them on trial for doing it, especially when culturally and legally, where they grew up, was a society where you absolutely followed orders, and the moral responsibility of those orders weren't on you for following them, they were on the people above you in the chain of command. Which gets us into a situation where I've had dozens of arguments in history classes when I've been a student, where the professor thought what the best question is, who's guilty in the final solution? Is it the guy who turns the knobs and activates the Zyklon B? Or the guy who fires down his iron sights as an Einsatzkommando? Or is the guilty party somebody in the bureaucracy who actually cuts the orders to make these things happen? Or is the moral responsibility for all of this on Adolf Hitler and Alfred Rosenberg and a number of other Nazi leaders who created the situation where you would have a major set of resources in the German government devoted to the extermination of entire race of people? Who should bear responsibility? The answer I came to, and I think the answer most reasonable people came to, is they're all responsible to some extent. So all of this is background. Hannah Arendt goes to the trial, and what she writes in articles for this magazine are then collected in a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem, which I have a couple of copies of in here. And she, rather than saying the expected thing, Eichmann, evil, satanic, evil jerk, die, 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 in a civilized way, calls into question his personality, the situation, the trial itself. She asks questions that are genuinely difficult. Questions that if I were more personally involved in the Holocaust, would drive me effing nuts, because she's calling into question our ability to assign blame for that atrocity. She also comes up with a concept which has been with us since, called the banality of evil. The word banal means everyday, without exception. Mediocre, banal. So a piece of art that's designed to make you feel something profound, that fails, is trite, is without power, that's banal. A person who makes an argument that is supposed to inspire you to do great things, who fails, who uses nothing but tired old tropes, that's banal. I'm making a speech tonight at the graduation. I hope I don't fall into that category, but we'll see. It's something I worry about. The definition really of banal is something that is completely everyday, unremarkable, common, without real quality. And she says in her articles that what she found in this man who she encountered across a courtroom for a couple of months is not a satanic demon in human form, nor was he a thoughtful ideologue. He was not a mustache-twirling, scene-chewing comic book villain. He was banal, every day. He spoke in cliches. He didn't seem to connect what he was doing with anything more broad than that. It was just his job. He didn't think about it. He didn't make the connection between his actions and any kind of morality. He was following orders. That's what he was there to do. He was a functionary. He had placed his volition as a human being at the disposal of the state, at the disposal of the party, at the disposal of the SS. He gave his ability to weigh matters and think about them and come to conclusions He gave that up. And what he did was so profoundly terrifying because it doesn't take a Hitler or a Mussolini or a Joe Stalin. It doesn't take somebody who's operatic in their villainousness. All it takes is somebody who's willing to do their job. And you have genocide. So it's not as satisfying as they expected. It was very controversial. And it was a campaign to get her fired from teaching at the school and to get her banned. Much more rare in the early 1960s. But she seemed to be questioning the moral clarity that people should have about the Holocaust. She wasn't. What she was doing was being a good philosopher. And a good philosopher doesn't take anything at face value. A good philosopher has to grapple with the serious questions. So, how's that for setup? Do you have any questions before I show you the final scene of a movie based on her experiences, where she goes before her students and her accusers to offer a brief apologia? Not an apology exactly, it's an explanation of what she was trying to do and what she was trying to think. So do you have any questions about the situation, about the Nazi war criminals who went to Argentina, about Adolf Eichmann, about his trial, about Hannah Arendt and her articles? Any question at all? Yeah.
Wait, so how did they get to Argentina? Was it by like bus or?
No, they flew. You fly. Argentina's on the other side of the world. It's in the southern hemisphere.
Okay. I didn't know if they like.
Yeah, no. They flew in and they flew him out. But again, they flew him out in such a way that they had to have a piece of paper with his signature. And there are a number of films about Eichmann and about these situations. One of the interesting things to me, just as a Hollywood factoid, Simon Wiesenthal is there, the central guy, because he is the ultimate hunter of Nazis. He spent his entire life dedicated after the Holocaust to bringing former Nazis and their collaborators to justice. And in a movie called Murderers Among Us, he was played by the actor Ben Kingsley. This was in the early 1990s, I think. Then, about 5 years ago, he was in another movie. Oh, God, I'm having difficulty recalling the title. But it's a movie about the capture of Eichmann and the way they got him to sign the paper. And Eichmann, the ultimate functionary who makes the final solution happen, is played by the same actor, Ben Kingsley. Finale, I think it's called. Operation Finale. I could be wrong, but I think that's it. So anyway, yes, sir.
What was it a jury trial or?
I think there were 3 judges. Yeah, in crimes against humanity, war crimes trials, usually what you have is a panel of judges. That's what was done with the Nuremberg trials. You had an American judge, a Soviet judge, a British judge. And in lesser trials, you'd have 3 judges from one power or another power or whatever. So a panel of judges. The reason it's not a jury is you're dealing with very complex, high concepts of law. And you don't want it to be an emotional thing. You want it to be rooted in law. I see no other questions. Okay. Well, we'll pause this and watch the scene and then... The manifestation of the winds of thought, not knowledge, but rather the ability to tell right from wrong. You may have noticed that I don't teach this course as an intellectual. I don't teach this course as a scholar. Those are wonderful things that I am not. I'm an intellectual in that I ask questions. I think, I talk. But I'm not a scholar. I don't care about scholasticism. I came to teaching later in life. At 35, I got my first full-time teaching job. Before that, I was in the world doing other things. And I can tell you, it's wonderful that you have so many teachers in your world that are teaching you to be good scholars. But there is a distraction that comes from a hyper-academic focus, a distraction from the moral reality of what we're studying. What we're studying in here is not an academic subject. It really isn't. Ultimately, on a basic level, your grades don't matter to me. What matters to me is that you think about things, that you try to understand why some people do heroic and some people do diabolical things, why some people intervene as protectors and why other people stand apart as bystanders and watch evil happen. Because the very human condition that we experience today is the same human condition that is at play throughout history. All history is the record of what people do when the chips are down, when they're desperate. The manifestation of the winds of thought is not knowledge. Knowledge is useful. Knowledge is good. But it's not as good as the ability to tell right from wrong. The Roman historian Asinius Pollio is to have said, according to at least Robert Graves, that the most important thing for a free people to have is a sense of smell. And he was using that line in relation to Tiberius, the second Roman emperor, who had a great deal of personal corruption and who was in the process of destroying much that was still republican in the early Roman Empire, in the Principate. If Americans lose, if humans lose, the ability to tell right from wrong, to tell good from evil, to tell beautiful from ugly, to tell what is wholesome from what stinks on ice, we lose something integral to our ability to make wise choices. Your logical mind may not understand a situation well enough to write a thesis paper about it, explaining in chapter and verse with all the evidence and all the footnotes properly cited why this is wrong and doing a certain thing is a bad idea. But on a gut level, you know it. And it is that very gut level that you have to cultivate. Because our society and our world doesn't care about it anymore. Instead, that gut sense of truth is attacked and attacked and attacked in the name of political faction and political gain and extreme interpretations of reality. You owe it to yourselves to never dismiss your instincts. A little animal doesn't have the sentience that you have. May not understand that going into that pipe is a bad idea intellectually, but he's not going into that pipe because everything in his instincts and his instinctual biochemical programming tells him going into that pipe is doomed, dangerous, deadly, fraught with all sorts of horror. I'm not going there. We human beings still retain that instinct, but we don't always use it. And so much of schooling and so much of knowledge is an attempt to train you out of that and have that be replaced by a fine logical mind. But a fine logical mind without a common sense notion of right and wrong, of good and evil, is what leads to Nazism and communism and theocracy and other forms of fanatical totalitarianism, where adherence to some ideal is much more valuable than adherence to common decency. You don't spit in someone's face. You don't beat up little old ladies. You don't allow children to be maimed and mutilated. You don't do these things or allow them to be done in your presence. Only bad people would. But that basic sense of decency, we've got to give that up. I recommend that you think about this. What is the manifestation of the of the wind of thought to you? What is the purpose of all of this education, of society, of thought? Is it for its own sake to make discoveries and unlock the secrets of the universe? Or is it to be some kind of servant to the moral sensibilities that we all, or almost always have? I have met a couple of people who are absolutely born wrong. They do not have a moral center. They are evil, capable of anything. I've encountered a couple of them. They are scary as hell. And when you encounter them, the hairs on the back of your neck will stand right up because some part of you will recognize what's going on. The question is, will you say, no, everything's fine? Or will you obey your common sense, which tells you, don't turn your back on this dangerous person and don't have anything to do with him. Just disengage. That's what I've done when I've encountered people like that. Multiple people. So, any thoughts about this? Because next week I'm going to give you a summary of post-World War II history. And I mean a summary. But thinking about this, bringing this lesson to its final proper stage is important. I see no questions. Yes?
Could we talk about this again on Monday?
If you have thoughts, bring it up at the beginning of class. Okay. I will say, after the liberation of the camps, the degree of the horror is manifest. Now, there were people who had been trying to get information out of the camps, for example, to the U.S. State Department. And there's been a historical conclusion that anti-Semites within the U.S. State Department undervalued the information, said this is just the equivalent of British calling Germans baby killers in World War I. It's propaganda, it's not real. Because either they couldn't imagine something so bad really happening, or they didn't want to acknowledge it. From these things, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were given appeals, please bomb the camps. Please bomb the camps. Doesn't matter, you're going to kill the Jews are going to be dead anyway. Don't let them die the way the Nazis are going to have them die. Bomb the camps. Break the system. Roosevelt refused to. Churchill didn't have the power to override him. And the reason was it had nothing to do with winning the war. The Air Force insisted if we're going to risk planes and pilots over enemy territory where they can get shot down and blown apart, it had better be to win the war. So one of the lost opportunities of the Holocaust was that the Allies did not bomb the camps. To think about the people who died is something most of us can do. But to think about what they might have done had they lived, the children they might have had, the grandchildren. The world is robbed every time there is a mass murder. Because not only is the person in the past ended, as far as this world is concerned, anything they would have done stillborn, anything they might have said, anything they might have discovered not happened. But they might have fallen in love, affected other lives, had children, grandchildren. There are whole groups of people that never will be because of the final solution and things like it. Those people are silenced. They can't give us the cure for cancer or the common cold because they've never been allowed to be born. We'll start next Monday with Never Again, and then we'll move into the Cold War. If you have any other thoughts, now's the time to ask if you want. Yeah?
I was watching a memorial video that they played at church last Sunday.
Yeah.
And one thing that the guy said on the video was that those people who died lost two lives, the lives that they had lived and the lives that they were going to live.
That's right. That's the sort of thing exactly that I'm trying to say. Death is a pretty final thing. It's a natural part of our lives, but mass murder is not. Mass murder is an exception. Thank God. Thank you. You can talk among yourselves.